In 1843, deep in North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, a scandal erupted that defied every law of God and man. Chang and Ang Bunker, the world-famous conjoined twins, married 2 sisters and fathered 21 children in a bizarre bid for normality. But what began as love spiraled into rivalry, psychological damage, and whispered horror. 2 homes, rotating husbands, bitter wives, and children trapped in a living experiment. As Sheriff Gilmer chronicled the emotional unraveling, one question haunted the community. When does the human need for connection become something monstrous? This is the true story of a family bound by blood and something far darker. Subscribe to stand with us as we document the stories history struggles to tell, and comment below with your city and time. Let us know where these forgotten accounts reach across the world. The year 1843 marked a turning point in the quiet, God-fearing communities of Surry County, North Carolina. Nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, this was a land where tobacco fields stretched toward distant ridges, and every family knew their neighbors back 3 generations. The roads were little more than rutted trails connecting isolated farms, and news from the outside world arrived weeks late, filtered through the sermons of Baptist preachers and gossip exchanged at the general store in White Plains. It was a society built on bedrock principles, hard work, Christian virtue, and an unwavering belief that certain natural laws simply could not be violated. Into this world of rigid tradition and deeply conservative values came 2 men who would challenge every assumption about what it meant to be human, what it meant to be married, and what it meant to build a family. Chang and Ang Bunker were already famous when they arrived in Surry County in the late 1830s. Born in Siam in 1811 and joined at the sternum by a band of cartilage and tissue, the brothers had spent their youth as the most celebrated curiosities of the age. A Scottish merchant named Robert Hunter had discovered them as teenagers and brought them to America, where they toured the great cities of the East Coast and Europe, exhibiting themselves before kings and common folk alike. They were billed as the Siamese twins, a term that would enter the English language because of them. By their late 20s, the brothers had grown weary of the constant scrutiny, the physicians who prodded them like laboratory specimens, the audiences who paid to gawk at their conjoined bodies. They bought their freedom from their managers, became naturalized American citizens, and used their considerable earnings to purchase land in the isolated hills of North Carolina. They chose the name Bunker, a common American surname, as if a simple change of identity could erase a lifetime of being seen as something other than men. The locals of Surry County initially regarded the twins with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. These were people unaccustomed to outsiders, particularly foreign-born outsiders who spoke with accents and carried themselves with an air of worldly sophistication. But the Bunkers were also wealthy, and in the hierarchy of the antebellum South, wealth commanded respect. They purchased over 600 acres of prime farmland, built a substantial home, and set about becoming gentlemen planters. They acquired enslaved workers to tend their fields just as their neighbors did. They attended the White Plains Baptist Church, though their presence in the pews caused no small amount of awkward glancing. They dressed in fine suits, spoke passable English, and conducted themselves with dignity. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept them as permanent fixtures of the landscape, if never quite as one of their own. It was in this fragile state of acceptance that the Bunkers made a decision that would shatter any hope of peaceful assimilation. They began courting the daughters of David Yates, a struggling farmer whose modest property lay within riding distance of the Bunker plantation. Adelaide and Sarah Yates were young women of limited prospects, their families' fortunes declining in an economy that favored larger landholders. The courtship itself was a source of immediate scandal. How could 2 men joined together in body court 2 separate women? The mechanics of such a relationship confounded and horrified the community in equal measure. When the Bunkers formally asked for the sisters' hands in marriage, David Yates found himself caught between financial desperation and social condemnation. The Bunkers were offering security, perhaps even prosperity, for his daughters. But accepting their proposal would make his family the subject of endless speculation and scorn. The marriages took place in April of 1843 in a small private ceremony that deliberately excluded most of the community. There was no grand celebration, no public announcement in the county records beyond the bare legal minimum. The twin brothers married the 2 sisters in a double ceremony that left witnesses shaking their heads in disbelief. Within months, both Adelaide and Sarah were pregnant, their conditions announced almost simultaneously, as if even their bodies were now bound by the same strange synchronicity that governed their husbands' lives. The community's reaction shifted from scandal to something approaching dread. This was no longer an oddity to be whispered about at church socials. This was a family taking root, a bloodline being established, and no one could predict what horrors or wonders such an unprecedented union might produce. The decade following the marriages saw the Bunker household expand at a pace that alarmed even the most prolific farming families of Surrey County. Adelaide gave birth to her first child in February of 1844, and Sarah delivered hers mere days later. This pattern would repeat itself with disturbing regularity over the next 15 years. By the time the 1850s drew to a close, 21 children had been born into this unprecedented family structure. 10 belonged to Adelaide and Chang, 11 to Sarah and Ang. The sheer mathematics of the situation confounded neighbors who tried to make sense of the arrangement. How could two women share husbands who could never be separated? The community's imagination ran wild with speculation about the intimate mechanics of the marriages, conversations carried out in hushed tones behind closed doors and never spoken of in polite company. But the true horror of the Bunker household was not physical. It was psychological. Within the first year of marriage, it became clear that Adelaide and Sarah could not peacefully coexist under one roof. The initial arrangement had placed both wives in the main house, sharing meals, sharing domestic duties, and sharing their husbands in a rotation that satisfied no one. Jealousy erupted like a brush fire. Adelaide accused Sarah of monopolizing Ang's attention during moments when he and Chang were meant to be attending to both wives equally. Sarah complained that Adelaide received preferential treatment in household decisions. The brothers found themselves caught between two women who had once been close sisters, but were now locked in a rivalry that grew more bitter with each passing month. The solution the Bunkers devised was as practical as it was profoundly strange. They built a second house on their property, placing it within sight of the first, but far enough away to create the illusion of separation. Adelaide would remain in the original home with her children. Sarah would take up residence in the new house with hers, and the brothers, conjoined as they were, would alternate between the two households on a rigid schedule of 3 days at each residence. Sheriff Gilmer first became aware that something deeply wrong was unfolding on the Bunker properties in the winter of 1852. He was a man of practical sensibilities who had served as Surrey County Sheriff for nearly a decade, keeping the peace through a combination of stern authority and an understanding that most disputes could be resolved with conversation rather than force. But the complaints he began receiving about the Bunkers were unlike anything in his experience. A farmhand who had worked the Bunker tobacco fields for a season came to his office with a disturbed expression, reporting that he had quit his employment because he could no longer bear the atmosphere of the place. The man described houses where silence hung like fog, where the wives rarely spoke to each other even when circumstances forced them into proximity, where children from one household would stare at children from the other with expressions of confusion and longing. He spoke of hearing one of the wives singing mournful hymns late into the night when the brothers were staying at the other residence, her voice carrying across the darkened fields like the cry of something wounded and trapped. Other reports followed. A woman who had briefly served as a governess to some of the Bunker children came forward with her own observations. She described a household divided not just by physical space but by an invisible wall of resentment and competition. The children were well fed and adequately clothed, but there was something haunted in their expressions, particularly the older ones, who understood that their family structure was the subject of endless community gossip. She mentioned that 2 of the children were deaf and could not speak. While such afflictions were not uncommon in rural areas, she wondered aloud whether the strain of their parents' unusual circumstances had somehow marked them. The governess had left her position not because of mistreatment, but because the weight of the household's silent suffering had become unbearable to witness. She told Sheriff Gilmer that what she had seen was not a crime in any legal sense, but it was a tragedy nonetheless, a slow grinding away of human dignity that no law could address. Sheriff Gilmer began riding the perimeter of the Bunker plantation on his regular rounds, observing from a distance. He saw the 2 houses standing like opposing fortresses, smoke rising from their chimneys in alternating patterns as the brothers moved between them. He saw children playing in separate yards who never crossed the invisible boundary between properties. and he understood that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his experience as a lawman. This was not a case of violence or theft or any crime defined by statute. This was a moral crisis, a family structure so profoundly unnatural that it was slowly destroying everyone trapped within it. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought new complications to the already strained Bunker household. Chang and Ang, despite their origins in distant Siam, had become fully invested in the Southern way of life. They owned 18 enslaved people who worked their tobacco fields and maintained their 2 households. When North Carolina seceded from the Union, the brothers aligned themselves with the Confederate cause, a decision that reflected both their economic interests and their desire to prove their loyalty to their adopted homeland. 2 of their sons would eventually serve in the Confederate Army, fighting for a cause that their famous fathers could not physically join. This alignment with the losing side of the war would bring financial ruin and further isolation to a family already living on the margins of social acceptability. But it was not the political turmoil of the war years that concerned Sheriff Gilmer most. It was the slow psychological destruction he witnessed in the 2 sister wives who had borne the weight of this impossible arrangement for nearly 2 decades. Through his careful inquiries and the testimony of those who had occasion to visit the Bunker properties, a portrait emerged of 2 women trapped in a competition that neither could win. Adelaide, the elder sister, had developed what the local physician, Dr. Josephus Hollingsworth, described as a nervous disposition. She suffered from bouts of anxiety that left her bedridden for days at a time, her hands trembling as she tried to manage her household and care for her 10 children. Sarah, by contrast, had grown harder and more withdrawn, her face settling into an expression of permanent disapproval. The sisters communicated only when absolutely necessary, their exchanges brief and cold, even when their husbands stood between them as unwilling mediators. Dr. Hollingsworth had been the Bunker family physician since the early days of the marriages, and his medical records painted a disturbing picture of the toll this arrangement had taken on everyone involved. He documented Adelaide's persistent headaches and stomach ailments, conditions he attributed to chronic stress and emotional exhaustion. He noted Sarah's episodes of profound melancholy, periods where she would barely speak for days on end. Most troubling were his observations about the children. While many were healthy and showed normal development, others exhibited signs of deep psychological distress. 2 of the children were deaf and unable to speak, a condition that Dr. Hollingsworth could not fully explain, but suspected might be related to the immense strain their mothers had endured during pregnancy. Several of the older children displayed what he called a haunted quality, an awareness that their family was fundamentally different from every other family in Surrey County, and that this difference marked them as outcasts. The doctor shared these concerns with Sheriff Gilmer in the spring of 1863, meeting him privately at his office in the county seat. Dr. Hollingsworth was a man of science who prided himself on objectivity, but he confessed that the Bunker case had shaken his professional detachment. He spoke of visiting the 2 houses and feeling the oppressive weight of unspoken suffering that hung in every room. He described examining the wives and seeing in their eyes a resignation that troubled him more than any physical ailment could. They were not being beaten or starved or confined against their will. They were simply trapped in a situation that offered no escape, bound by marriage vows and social expectation to men they could never fully possess, and to a rivalry with their own sister that would last until death. What Sheriff Gilmer came to understand was that the true crime being committed on the Bunker plantation was not one that any court could adjudicate. It was the crime of imposing an unnatural structure on human hearts and expecting those hearts to endure without breaking. The brothers themselves were not cruel men by nature. They provided for their families, attended to their children's education, and maintained their properties with the same diligence as any other planters in the county. But their very existence as conjoined twins had created an impossible situation. They could not give their wives the independence and individual attention that any marriage required. They could not prevent the jealousy and competition that arose from sharing their lives between 2 separate households. And they seemed incapable of recognizing that their desperate attempt at normality had created something far worse than the life of exhibition they had fled. As the war dragged on and the Confederacy crumbled, bringing economic devastation to the entire region, Sheriff Gilmer began to notice a darker pattern emerging. Fences on the Bunker properties were being cut in the night, allowing livestock to wander onto neighboring farms. Crops were trampled by unknown trespassers. A threatening note was left nailed to the door of Chang's house, its message scrawled in crude handwriting, warning that abominations would not be tolerated in God's country. The community's long-simmering fear and disgust were beginning to boil over into something dangerous. Sheriff Gilmer understood that he was running out of time to prevent violence. The escalating harassment of the bunker properties was following a pattern he had seen before in rural communities, where fear and moral outrage combined into something explosive. He had no legal grounds to arrest the brothers for any crime, but he also could not stand by while vigilante justice took root in his county. In the autumn of 1867, he made a decision that would force the entire community to confront what had been festering in whispers and sidelong glances for nearly a quarter-century. He arranged for a public meeting to be held at the White Plains Baptist Church and personally rode out to the bunker plantation to request that Chang and Ang attend. It was not a summons, but an invitation, though both men understood the unspoken threat behind it. If they did not face the community in a controlled setting, they might soon face them as an uncontrolled mob. The meeting took place on a cold November evening, when darkness fell early over the mountain foothills. The church was packed with every family of standing in White Plains and the surrounding farms. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the whitewashed walls as Sheriff Gilmer called the assembly to order. He spoke plainly about the purpose of the gathering, acknowledging that tensions had reached a point where they threatened the peace of the entire county. He then invited anyone with grievances against the Bunker family to speak their mind in this forum, under his supervision, rather than through acts of vandalism and intimidation in the night. What followed was a cascade of fear and prejudice that had been building for decades, finally given voice in the sanctified space of the community's spiritual center. A church deacon stood first, a gray-haired patriarch whose family had farmed these hills for 3 generations. He spoke in the measured cadence of a man accustomed to moral authority, citing scripture and natural law to argue that the bunker marriages were an abomination before God. He pointed to passages about the sanctity of marriage between one man and one woman, conveniently ignoring the Old Testament patriarchs who had taken multiple wives. He argued that the very existence of the bunker household was a stain on the moral character of the community, that children growing up in its shadow would be corrupted by proximity to such unnatural arrangements. His words were met with solemn nods and murmurs of agreement from much of the assembled crowd. Others followed with more personal grievances. A neighbor woman tearfully recounted seeing the bunker children playing in their separate yards, never crossing the invisible boundary between the 2 houses, and declared that such a childhood was a form of cruelty, no law acknowledged, but every heart recognized. A former farmhand spoke of the oppressive silence within the households, the palpable tension that made even simple conversations feel dangerous. A mother clutched her young daughter and said she feared what lessons such a family taught about the proper order of things, about the boundaries that separated human beings from beasts. The accusations were not of specific crimes, but of a more fundamental transgression against the natural and social order. The bunkers, these voices argued, had brought chaos into a world that depended on clear rules and strict boundaries for its survival. Through it all, Chang and Ang sat together on a front pew, their conjoined bodies forcing them to face the crowd as one, even as their individual expressions revealed their different reactions to the onslaught. Chang's face had darkened with anger, his jaw clenched and his fists balled on his knees. Ang remained outwardly calmer, though those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes as he listened to his neighbors catalog every way his family had failed to meet their expectations, when Sheriff Gilmer finally gave them the opportunity to respond. It was Chang who spoke first, his voice thick with accent and emotion. He rose as much as his connection to his brother would allow, and addressed the assembly with barely controlled fury. He spoke of spending his youth as an object of curiosity, exhibited in halls and theaters across 2 continents, never allowed privacy or dignity or the simple right to walk down a street without drawing stares. He spoke of coming to North Carolina with hope that in this remote corner of America, he and his brother might finally live as ordinary men with ordinary desires for home and family. Then Ang spoke, his tone softer but no less powerful. He talked about the love he felt for his wife Sarah and his children, about the joy he took in watching them grow despite all the obstacles their family faced. He acknowledged that their situation was unusual, perhaps unprecedented, but asked what alternative they had been given. Should they have remained unmarried and childless simply because their bodies were joined? Should they have denied themselves the fundamental human experiences of partnership and parenthood because others found their circumstances uncomfortable? He did not ask for approval or even acceptance. He asked only for the right to be left alone, to raise their families in peace on land they had purchased with money they had earned. His words hung in the air of the church, unanswerable and undeniable, a challenge to every person in that room to explain what crime had actually been committed beyond the crime of being born different. The meeting at White Plains Baptist Church ended not with resolution, but with exhaustion. No votes were taken, no decisions rendered, no punishment imposed. Sheriff Gilmer had achieved his primary objective of preventing immediate violence, but he had not healed the fundamental divide between the Bunker family and the community that surrounded them. The brothers returned to their two households and their rigid 3-day rotation, continuing a domestic arrangement that satisfied no one but offered no clear alternative. The harassment of their properties ceased, replaced by something perhaps worse, a wall of cold silence. Neighbors who had once grudgingly acknowledged the twins now averted their eyes when passing them on the road. Invitations to community gatherings stopped arriving. The Bunkers and their 21 children became ghosts haunting the margins of Surrey County society, visible but never truly seen, present but never truly accepted. The final years of Chang and Ang Bunker's lives were marked by physical decline and escalating tension between the brothers themselves. In 1870, Chang suffered a stroke that paralyzed his right side and left him partially dependent on Ang for mobility. This shift in their lifelong balance of power proved devastating. Chang had always been the more volatile of the two, quicker to anger and more given to excess. Now, trapped in a failing body and tethered to a brother who remained relatively healthy, his temperament grew darker. He drank heavily, a habit that Ang despised but could not prevent, as any alcohol Chang consumed affected them both. Arguments between the brothers became frequent and bitter, their lifelong bond fraying under the strain of Chang's declining health and growing resentment. The wives, who had barely spoken to each other for years, now had to coordinate care for two men whose needs had become dramatically different, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. On the night of January 17, 1874, Chang and Ang retired to bed in Chang's house, where they had been staying for their scheduled 3-day rotation with Adelaide. Chang had been complaining of chest pain throughout the evening, but such complaints had become common in recent years and were largely dismissed as part of his general physical deterioration. Sometime in the early morning hours, Ang awoke to find his brother cold and still beside him. Chang had died in his sleep, likely from a blood clot that had traveled to his heart or brain. Ang immediately called for help, but in the isolated darkness of the rural North Carolina night, assistance was hours away. He lay tethered to his brother's corpse, unable to move, unable to separate himself from the death that had claimed half of his conjoined body. Dr. Hollingsworth would later report that Ang was conscious and lucid when he arrived near dawn, expressing terror at his situation but showing no signs of immediate physical distress. Yet within 3 hours of his brother's death, Ang himself passed away. The official cause was listed as fright, though modern medical understanding suggests that the shared circulatory system that had bound them in life ultimately ensured they could not long survive. Apart in death, the autopsy that followed was conducted by Dr. Hollingsworth, along with physicians from Philadelphia who had long wanted to examine the famous twins. They found that Chang and Ang had been connected by a band of cartilage and tissue approximately 4 inches long at the sternum, and that their livers had been partially fused. The doctors concluded that surgical separation would have been possible with the medical techniques available even in their lifetime, though the risks would have been substantial. This revelation added a tragic footnote to their story. The brothers had lived their entire lives believing separation was impossible, building their unusual domestic arrangement around the assumption that they had no choice but to remain physically joined. In death, science revealed that they might have chosen different paths, might have lived as separate men with separate families, had they only known it was possible. Adelaide and Sarah Bunker were left as widows at 49 and 50 years old, respectively, each managing a household full of children ranging from infants to adults. The plantation lands were divided between the two families, ensuring that the geographic separation that had defined their marriages would continue into their widowhood. Historical records indicate that the sisters never reconciled, living out their remaining years as neighbors who maintained the cold distance that had characterized their relationship for 3 decades. Sarah died in 1892, 18 years after her husband. Adelaide lived until 1917, surviving her husband by 43 years and outlasting her sister by a quarter century. She was 72 years old when she finally escaped the shadow of the most unusual marriage in American history. The 21 children of Chang and Ang Bunker dispersed across North Carolina and beyond, some embracing their unique heritage and others fleeing from it as far as geography would allow. Many married and had children of their own, and the Bunker bloodline expanded exponentially through the generations. Today, the descendants of Chang and Ang number over 1,500 individuals, many of whom still gather for periodic family reunions in the same region where their famous ancestors once scandalized polite society. The White Plains Baptist Church, where that fateful confrontation took place, still stands, and in its cemetery rest the mortal remains of Chang and Ang Bunker, buried together in a specially constructed coffin that accommodated their joined bodies. Their story endures not as a tale of monsters, but as a profoundly human tragedy about the desperate search for normality in circumstances that offered no template for normal life. It stands as a reminder that sometimes the greatest horrors are not acts of violence, but the slow, grinding psychological toll of living under the weight of society's judgment, trapped in situations from which there is no escape and for which there are no adequate solutions. The Bunker case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the boundaries of acceptable family structures, about the rights of individuals to define their own lives even when those definitions offend prevailing moral standards, and about the terrible price paid by those caught between their own humanity and a world that insists on seeing them as something less or other than fully human.